Okay. Morning, everybody. I think we'll get going so that we can keep to time. Thank you for all coming to this session, which is the last session. Ooh, okay, the last, the last. I'm not crazy about my voice, but anyway, which is the last session of the community track. And my name is Michelle Dutoy. I'm based here in Cape Town. Welcome to Cape Town, everyone. And I work at South South North as part of the CDKN program, which is a climate change knowledge brokering program. And I'm joined in the moderation by Suchi Vora from the Global Resilience Partnership. And why we're here today is really to look at the underneath, like what lies underneath resilience measurement. In Afrikaans, we've got this saying, stille waters, diepe grond, onder draai die duivel rond, which means like where there's still waters, it's very, very deep ground, and that's where the devil is lurking around. So I think what we want to do is look at what are the assumptions. We're going to have a fishbowl session, so we're going to encourage conversation. We're going to encourage you to be reflective and be open-minded and look at what are our assumptions that we're not bringing to the fore around measurement. Like, who are we measuring for? What are we measuring for? Who is it going to be useful for? How must we change our minds and our way of looking at this to be more effective and accurate, whatever effective and accurate actually really means in our measurement. So what we're going to start off with is we're going to be joined shortly by Aditya Bahran from the IIED, and he's also part of the Adaptation Research Alliance. And he's going to talk to us a bit about the locally led adaptation principles. We've heard a lot about locally led adaptation. A lot of people are speaking about it. I think a lot of times it is lip service and it's not real locally led adaptation. Dr. Taylor has been talking about what is community-led, what is other-led. So we're going to start off with looking at these principles. And Aditya, there'll also be some time for you to engage. Oh, hello. Hi, Aditya. I don't know, can you see us? Yeah.
We can see and hear you very clearly.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thanks, Aditya. Sorry that you couldn't make it through with our visa system. Yes, so we're going to listen to Aditya. He's going to talk us through some of the principles, and then we're going to go into this fishbowl where we're really going to start looking at what the assumptions are, what's lying underneath all of this. So I'll hand over to you, Aditya.
Great.
Are you
Michelle,
good?
thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Michelle, a thumbs up or thumbs
Yes.
down from you would be useful.
Pardon?
You can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. If anything goes wrong, I'll shout.
Wonderful, and I can hear you perfectly as well. I'm really delighted to be joining you virtually for this discussion. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there. We'll blame the visa gods for that. But yes, I'm really glad that the AV system is working so well that we can speak here. Can I just check how many minutes I have? I have 10 minutes, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes, you've got 10 minutes. And
So
then
all
we
the
can have
10,
some.
oh, no, no, go on.
And then you can have some time for questions as well so that the participants here can interact with you a bit. So go ahead.
Okay, great. Over the next 10 minutes, we're going to be talking about locally led adaptation and specifically how we measure locally led adaptation. I have 5 slides. I don't know if those can be projected on the slide set for this. I'm on slide number 5. Is that possible, or should I just share my screen?
Suchi's just finding out what the best way is.
Okay. I'll just talk while that happens, and then Michelle just stop me whenever
Okay.
we have a resolution. So a little bit of background. I think all of you would have heard this term, locally led adaptation, over the last few years. It's become really.
Aditya, we
Go
can
on.
see the slides now. So the slides were on, and you said we must go to the fifth slide.
Correct. It should say locally led adaptation markers and metrics.
Yes, yes, it's up.
Wonderful. So before I launch into the content, I just want to give a little bit of framing where all of you would have heard about locally led adaptation. It's become a salient discourse over the last 2, 3 years. A number of big governments and donors have agreed to localize their support for adaptation. Um, but I think what is less known is that we've come to this juncture, and this acknowledgement for locally led adaptation, I'm on slide number 6 now, is a result of over 2 decades of practice, of different kinds of experiments, of different kinds of initiatives taking place across the world. And these have resulted in the distillation of 8 principles of locally led adaptation, that form the essential tenets of this movement, of this discourse, of this policy process, whatever we want to call it. I'll go through these very quickly because they're essential for what we want to discuss, in this presentation. These 8 principles, none of them are rocket science, but I think all of them are really valuable. The first principle is that we need to make sure that decision making for adaptation is taking place at the lowest appropriate level. We're not saying that every decision on adaptation processes has to be made at the lowest level, but those decisions that can must be made at the local level. The second principle talks about addressing structural inequalities, essentially underlines that we need to engage with issues of caste, class, power, intersectional marginalities, as opposed to merely focusing on the proximate causes of risk. Principle number 3 is around providing patient and predictable funding. These principles argue that for LLA to come to life, we need to have initiatives that are funded for 7 years or more, and that local organizations can access pots of funding that are ring fenced for them. So a local NGO in a developing country is not competing with an international institution for the same pot of money. Principle number 4 is about investing in in local capabilities, where we're trying to build, where we are committing to build capacity of local institutions, local actors through processes of adaptation. The next principle is around building a robust understanding of climate risk and uncertainty, which means that we need to employ um, different kinds of knowledge, local knowledge, expert knowledge, um, to and meld these together to make sense of how the climate is changing. It is not enough for us to just use top-down scientific information and develop solutions for a very carefully predicted future. Of course, ensuring transparency and accountability is important. At the moment, all M&E processes of adaptation finance seem to be oriented towards donors. We need to make sure that they're oriented towards communities that they're serving as well. And the final point around collaborative action and investment aims to ensure that multiple different donors, multiple different organizations aren't doing overlapping things in the same geographic areas, burdening communities. So these are the pillars of the locally led adaptation movement. Now, on the next slide, as I said, the movement has gathered a lot of momentum. Almost 100 entities across the world have formally endorsed these principles. This includes 10 governments, multilateral banks, bilateral agencies. And very quickly, from a focus on endorsement, the discussion has moved on to operationalization. How do we operationalize these principles in our everyday work? Now, everyone knows that you can only do what you can measure, and therefore, this discussion that we're having together on measurement and evidence is crucially important. Now, we've been grappling with how do we really measure the operationalization of these landmark principles, and there are lots of possibilities. We've considered the idea of guidelines, we've considered the idea of indicators, of metrics, of different qualities. But I think what we are now leaning towards is, based on the consultations that we've had, is that we need a set of markers that are a mix of indicators, guidelines, and metrics. I'll give you an example in a minute. And what I really want feedback on is whether you think this is a good idea or not. So, what are these markers? What are we talking about? We haven't yet developed a complete set of markers. We've done a few experiments to see what might work. And I want to here just trust all of you and share some tentative forays we've made into developing these markers to get a sense check, a finger in the wind test to see whether these are helpful, whether these are not helpful, how should we change these, how should we amend these, how far are we from what you think would be useful as as markers for measuring the operationalization of NLA. On slide 8, on the next slide, you will see an example of what I mean. So, what we've tried to do here is we've taken each principle and based on initial consultations, we realized that it would be most useful for us to think about markers to gauge the operationalization of each principle across three different steps in an idealized program process. So we're talking about the planning stage, the implementation stage, and the evaluation stage. The second thing that became patently obvious to us early on is that having one consolidated set of markers for everyone isn't useful because what a donor might want to measure is quite different from how a local organization might want to measure the operationalization of the principle. So we've looked at three different steps in the program cycle, but we've looked at four different stakeholder groups: donors, intermediaries, governments, and local organizations that might be implementing LLA projects. Now, I won't take you through each of the whatever it is, 12 grids. On this slide, I'll just give you examples of two different stakeholder groups. So let's take principle one, which is devolved decision making to the lowest appropriate level. As I said, the first principle argues that local organizations, local actors need to be in a leadership position when it comes to decision making on adaptation action. So if you're looking at, if I'm a donor trying to operationalize this principle, what are some of the markers that I might be able to use? So one is 70% or more of the project finance for the project that I'm designing, is it aimed and designed directly to go to local institutions? The 70% figure comes from a set of analytics that we've done to arrive at this. Also, can we ask in the project proposal, are the project's activities, outputs, and intended outcomes open to be designed, defined by local actors? Or has the donor taken decisions on what these activities and outputs should be sitting in a boardroom in New York or Bangkok or New Delhi or Nairobi or wherever? So that's at the planning stage, right? When you're just getting going. At the implementation stage, we can simply ask, are local actors included in the project steering committee and in different working groups that have a leadership role in determining how the project unfolds? And at the evaluation stage, we might ask, are reporting requirements adjusted to the capacities and needs of local actors so as not to distract them from their main work? Because one of the main feedbacks that we got was from local organizations that donors might give $50,000, but then that comes with nine different M&E missions across a 3-year project that takes away from the ability of local organizations to actually deliver the project. So these are just illustrations of the types of things that we might query when it comes to donors wanting to operationalize principle number one. Similarly, let's look at one other stakeholder group before moving on to the next principle, which is of a local organization trying to implement a locally led adaptation project. And here, okay, let's just look at the implementation stage. Um, so, like, if we could ask, are stakeholders adhering to the framework for decision making, which underlines that local entities and local people on the ground need to be determining what adaptation actions are based on this bottom line? In the evaluation stage, we might ask that are organizations or entities that are led by marginalized groups conducting monitoring and evaluation as opposed to a highly extractive, expert-led M&E process where data is collected with a view to reporting it back to donors. So these are some types of markers that we are playing around with at the moment for principle number one. And I'll finish by just giving an example of another principle so just so you get a flavor of what we're talking about here. Let's take principle five, which is building a robust understanding of climate risk and uncertainty. As I said, this principle is about melding different kinds of knowledge to determine pathways for action, ensuring that it's not only top-down scientific knowledge that is harbored by experts that is determining what happens. So, so, for example, let's take another stakeholder group. We're talking about, say, governments. And if governments, and we have 10 national governments that have signed up to these principles, want to gauge whether they're operationalizing this principle, they might want to examine whether they emphasize the importance of local knowledge in relevant policies, strategies, and guiding documents. For instance, sorry, Brazil's national adaptation plan underlines the importance of indigenous knowledge in adaptation decision making and enshrines the importance of the role of local communities and their insights on climate change determining adaptation action. If you're talking about intermediary organizations, this might be an international NGO that is getting a grant for locally led adaptation and sub-granting to a local entity. We might ask them if their role includes an emphasis on working with local organizations to combine local knowledge and scientific knowledge in the decisions that they need to make. So I won't now go into more detail. I think you got a sense of what we're talking about here. I do, however, I'm very happy to answer any questions, but I have 5 questions for you. So the first question is, should markers be used as a decision-making tool? Should Other types of examples that I've given you, are they good enough? Are they detailed enough? Um, how should we make sure that markers align with M&E systems? Um, which level of stakeholder should be responsible for tracking markers? Is it reasonable for us to expect that local organizations will also use these? Some have suggested that we should also have them for individual beneficiaries, which personally I don't think is useful. At the moment, the way we structure these markers, they are binary yes or no questions. Personally, I'm not sure if that's most useful. Should we have multiple choice questions, but then allow us to develop heat maps of how close or far individual stakeholders might be from operationalizing LLA principles in the context of a project? So this is just to give you a flavor of some initial forays we're making for developing a set of markers for operationalizing LLA principles. All feedback at this stage is extremely useful. Back to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Aditya. Thank you for. I'm really finding it very interesting, the whole markers conversation. And it seems like it's a lot more useful and getting to the actual crux of the issues. So Aditya's posed these questions to us. Is there anyone that wants to start answering or giving their views on the questions? If you can just say what your name is and which question.
My name's Lisa van der Merwe. The questions about should it be used and your yes, no, I don't actually see this one particularly, but I think these are valuable. You're asking whether as a decision-making tool. I would recommend it's valuable as a joint sense-making and meaning-making conversation starter. Which can inform the decision. It's not necessarily the decision per se. And then my recommendations, rather than yes, no, look at levels of maturity. So I'm thinking of capability maturity models that I've employed for reporting on maturity towards resilience principles. And it won't be exactly the same, but you can probably look at levels of maturity. There are different indicators that exist, as well as specifically for resilience. I'm thinking of the British Standard. I'm using those, the British Standard 65,000. I'm using those as measures and standardized indicators across multiple adaptive capacity indicators. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Lisa.
Can
Should we, do you want to respond now?
I just want to respond to Lisa to say thank you very much. I think that's really useful. Your point on this being used as a sense-making tool is really well taken. Lisa, on the capability maturity issue, so like we're using a resilience maturity curve for another initiative that I'm working on. The challenge, however, here is we're trying to surmount the needs of so many different types of stakeholders with one consolidated output that we have to strike that balance between these being sort of imminently usable by a local NGO that might have 20 people and is working at the village level, and by an international multilateral bank that might be putting in $100 million in locally led adaptation. So I think that's the challenge that we're grappling with. I suspect what you're saying on maturity, the maturity markers and using the British standard is, I feel like some local organizations might struggle with that. But I don't know if that's a cop out on our part.
Thanks, Aditya. I'm going to hand over to Charles here, and then to Gina, and then over there.
Thank you, Aditya. This is Charles Tanui from African Research and Impact Network. In your seventh slide, you introduced guidelines, indicators, metrics, qualities, and markers. And my recent engagement, especially with the policymakers, is that how they are applied in the policy making and legislation making, they've got different meaning. Because if you use guideline, is it a guideline that is supporting the operationalization of a plan, a policy, or a legislation? If it's an indicator, is it to guide in terms of identifying the targets set by the government? And it's very good that if you can expound on why did you decide on the markers and what qualities or weights that markers are bringing on board. And then the second point is the questions to consider. Should markers be more detailed, especially into contractual, budgetary details, or generalized? And I'll take also the position from the recent engagement with the policymaker. If you are engaging a policymaker, are you going to address the thematic approach or adaptation approach, or maybe SDG approach in terms of discussing the investments? And one of the advisors of the policymaker actually told us that when you're engaging the policymakers, first they'll put forward thematic because it's very basic and it's very easy to budget. So what are the complexities or how do we really address now? We are thinking about resilience in terms of delineating in the engagement the metrics for thematic based and then for adaptation and resilience as an outcome.
Aditya?
Charles,
Want to respond?
wonderful to see you again, and thank you for the really easy question. I'm being sarcastic. I think you've raised a number of very difficult questions, Charles. Let me try and answer them very quickly. I think on the choice of markers, as I was just saying to Lisa, I think the struggle that we had was we've been asked to produce something that crosses a number of boxes, right? We need to produce something that allows people to structure and design initiatives, but also to measure the degree to which those initiatives might be aligning with the principles of locally led adaptation. So I felt like, based on consultations, that indicators would not adequately do the former, i.e., they would be very useful for designing initiatives. So we defaulted to the markers, which lend themselves to the development of indicators. So we felt having a huge bank of LLA indicators isn't useful because however much we might apply ourselves, we're never going to have a comprehensive set that is going to be usable by every kind of actor trying to implement every kind of LLA project with different timelines, with different budgets in different geographies, with different sectoral focuses, etc. So these markers, in our view, are intended to permit the development of indicators, permit the influence of M&E process, permit people can use them to influence their M&E processes, but also they are equally aimed to ensure that we can start to influence the design of initiatives and people can use them at the planning stage to determine how they're going to deliver what they're going to deliver. I think on your second question, in terms of thematic focus, I think the intent of this is much more limited. I don't think we're talking about sort of wide policy processes. We're very narrowly talking about investments that are being mindfully being made in locally led adaptation. How do we make sure that there is some integrity with which this term is being employed in the context of those in investments, so that when we're saying that we're investing X amount of money in locally led adaptation, we have some set of markers to actually determine that it is locally led adaptation.
Thanks, Aditya. Handing over to Gina.
Thanks. Gina Seervogel here from University of Cape Town. Thanks, Aditya. I want to address the last two questions, the yes-no one, to start with. So I can see why that is really useful to have this kind of set of markers with these answers. But before you even pose those questions, I was like, there's so much behind each one of those. So I feel a narrative has to go with it. The yes-no was, majority, were there local stakeholders involved in decision-making? You might answer no, but there was a process that tried, and this is what happened, and these were the challenges. Or yes, and this, is what happened and why and how we got there and what does yes actually mean, who are those people who are involved, etc. So I don't know if there would be the capacity to have a narrative for each one of those questions, but it definitely feels for each one of the principles you would want a narrative to support that. I think the stakeholder question's interesting because my immediate answer was like, which level of stakeholder should answer that? I would want the community level and the donors or implementers and see the differences in perspective. Do the community members think that there was local decision making, or do they think not? And similarly, what do different actors across scales think? And I think that would be very telling. But I can see how, for me, knowing, getting these markers from a locally led adaptation project would tell me a lot of information. So I do find it very exciting from that perspective. And then my question back to you is, this session on the Communities Track was actually entitled Rethinking Agency. And how do we measure shifts in agency and power? And so what I wanted to know from you is, do you think this is captured anywhere sufficiently, or might you think more carefully about agency and power in these markers? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for listening in and attending the session. So just to reflect on some of the really useful points that you've made, I think on the point of narrative, you're absolutely right. But for the last couple of weeks, you had one progression in our thinking on how we should structure these. So I put myself in the shoes of a program manager for an NGO that is expected to respond to these markers, right? Because we've got some money in the name of locally led adaptation. And immediately, because I played that role in the past, immediately, immediately it was clear to me that I would treat this as a tick box exercise, right? I would say, of course. I mean, of course, so, we've consulted local communities in determining action. Of course, we're using different kinds of knowledge. So I would say yes, 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 quickly. Because the questions, as they're structured at the moment, as I shared with you, it's clear there's a value judgment in the questions, right? Have 70% of communities been, whatever, have communities been consulted in determining actions? There's only one right answer to that is yes. So I'm really keen and I'm pushing the team to rethink the way that we're framing these questions so that they're more value neutral. And then we have drop down menus or Likert scales where people can rate themselves. So instead of saying, have local communities been consulted in the development of adaptation actions, we ask something like, who are the stakeholder groups that you've consulted in the development of adaptation actions? And then there's an underlying algorithm to the answer. So if they say local communities, they're marked more positively on the scale of whether this is aligning with LLA. If that stakeholder group doesn't figure in their multiple answers that might give to this question, they're marked more negatively. So I'm sorry to go back to you, but just a sense check from you whether that is a more helpful direction to go in would be useful. I see you nodding, so I'll take that as a yes. I think that would be that's really good to know. And I agree with you. I think part of the excitement of this is that we might have the same investment and we might get really different answers from donors and from local organizations for the markers on the same principles. And I think as a researcher, I'm licking my lips, looking forward to receiving some of that data and working on that. In terms of agency, that's a difficult question. I mean, as with all these processes, you know, depends on how they're being used. They could be used really progressively to really change things, or they can be used in a slightly more technocratic way, just to rubber stamp processes that might already be in happening. So we can ex ante try and structure these markers in a way that tips the process more towards being used progressively to rethink power relations. But I think I have to be realistic in it's actually going to be in the performance of how these markers are used that real difference will be elucidated, will come to life. I also want to take slightly the weasel's way out of your question by arguing that if these markers are supporting the operationalization of locally led adaptation, that in itself is quite a radical rethinking of how agency currently works in adaptation financing processes. And now I've lost the microphone. I can't hear Michelle, but I can see Julio sitting next to Michelle. Hi, Julio.
Oh yeah, that's much better. So we've got 3 more questions, and then I think I'm gonna let the participants here ask you 1 or 2 questions, and then we need to move into the fishbowl discussions. So I'll start off, and I think, should we take two questions? Is that okay for you, Aditya? And then we end off with Bill there.
Thank you. My name is Simon. I'm from K, Zimbabwe. Apparently, my question or my contribution has been partially contributed. I wanted to talk about the question which you raised on which level of stakeholders should be responsible for tracking markers. I would think that it needs to be a collaborative process, but in the collaborative process, we need to then find ways of how to put the local communities at the forefront. I think this is quite complex because in most of the programs that I've experienced, we do it in a way that it's almost like a talk show, but we really need to then dig deep in terms of how do we make it very meaningful for the local people, and how do we also push some mechanisms to ensure that the local people will take it beyond a project lifeline, and also the issue of agents. How do we then develop the agents to be in a position to operate in that space in terms of having some decisions if they are not comfortable with any of the things that we are talking about? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Shanaz, and then I'll give you a chance to respond, Aditya, before ending off.
Thank you. Hi, Aditya. So mine links very nicely with that question. So Aditya, I'm sitting and looking at all the nice measurements and that, but for me, what I'm missing is a feedback loop. And often it's feeling like you're doing all these things at the end, whereas when you're designing something, you want to have the feedback and the measurement all along the pipeline, the project, or whatever you call it, pathway, and so that you have true adaptation, not only in terms of the action that's happening, but also in terms of the process. What I heard quite a bit, and it's a bit of a niggle for me, is that the local communities are consulted and involved in the decision. In terms of agency, should it not be coming everything from the local community? And then even when, in terms of who is this data for, it's for the researchers, for the donors, and I feel it's time and I think I said it yesterday, but we flip that whole narrative. I think we also need to be very careful about the local-led adaptation or action narrative, because what came out at the SBs on the sidelines now in Bonn is that it's coming from the north, it's undermining national governments and all their NAPs. So it's looking like the money is coming into the country but bypassing a lot of existing processes. And how do you account for that in your assessment of whether LLA has happened, et cetera, et cetera? So I think it's complex issues, but I think just to have it like fore of mind, because else we end up with lots of very exciting data, Aditya, that we can do all sorts of stuff with, but then for what and for who? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Shanaz. So over to you, Aditya, and then I've got chance there was a hand here by Bill, and then I'm going to squeeze you in, but then we have to, I have to be strict and stop. So Aditya, over to you.
I mean, I'll be honest. I think both the questions for me were very useful points of feedback and input, as opposed to me having to respond to, I think, things that have been raised. But I will very quickly. I think, especially to Shena. Shena, thank you so much for attending the session. I think the points you've raised are valid, but I, I would argue that what we're trying to do here is something much more limited, right? I think we're trying to develop basically some guidance to help people who got money in the name of LLA and are trying to determine the degree to which they're trying to operationalize these principles. I agree with you. I think there are larger structural questions of potentially some sources for locally led adaptation bypassing institutional systems. And then that has all other kinds of problems and duplication and burdening and governments not being bought in, etc. I'm not sure if you're going to solve that with a set of markers, right? I think that's the broader political economy of adaptation finance. The satisfactory answer is unsatisfactory answer from my side, Shanaz, is that those are really valid issues, but I would argue beyond the scope of our markers. Um, and I think in terms of, I think both the people who just spoke raised the issue about communities being in the driver's seat of this. So fundamentally, as a value, I'm fully agreed with that. And I think that's why we've also made sure that there are four different kinds of stakeholders that we're talking about here. But also, we need to be realistic about the fact that like, to what extent can we hold communities liable to be using metrics such as these in return for potentially very small amounts of money that they're getting, right? And they might lack capacity, might mean diversion of resources, etc. So as a value, I agree with you that they need to be there, but we need to acknowledge that this might be overburdening them. So, like one of the solutions to this problem that has been suggested is that perhaps whatever the stakeholders might be using these markers for, the results need to be corroborated, validated, extended, reviewed, critiqued by community members, as opposed to us expecting them to use these markers directly. So, I think we have to find these workarounds.
Okay. Thanks, Aditya. Last two questions.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Aditya. My name is Bill Simmons. I'm at the University of Arizona. I'd like us to problematize the concept of community or local people. And maybe that calls for like a fifth set of markers. I know when we work with a community, we're really working with community representatives. People who the real marginalized people in the community may not feel represented by. And when we work with those people, we're working with the people who speak English more, the more educated people, the more extroverts who are willing to come out and see the Land Rovers and things like that. And so I wonder what steps you're taking to get beyond that to the more marginalized people in the community, because if we don't do that, we're really reinforcing power structures within the community. We're further taking away agency from people who are already very much without agency. So just wonder your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to hand over to you and then to Aditya.
Yeah, thank you. And the word you used, squeezed me in, right? I think represents the actual matter. That many times communities are squeezed in. And, following what, he's saying. Yeah, that's the truth. So, because sometimes it gets a space where, it's owned by certain people and everybody knows everybody. And that changes the conversation. So, thanks for your presentation, Aditya. And I'm just thinking that for purposes of, yes, metrics, yes, locally led adaptation and so on, I think as long as we do not keep it simple, because thinking about the person who is, we're talking resilience, and I didn't even say my name. My name is Dorothy Moroki, and I'm with APT Associates in Uganda. I lead a USAID-funded activity, resilience activity. And so I'm thinking about the multiple attempts we have to basically collect, report, the indicators we work with, etc. And the journey of helping how does that data, how do those metrics help the community? How is it data utilization? We know that oftentimes we collect mountains of good data, and important, but begs the question, data for who and how is it utilized? Until we can be able to break it down so that it is of use to the person who is, it's going to be of use, that it's going to help in decision making at the community level. If it's going to be for decision making at the next level, again, just the whole issue of power structures and power dynamics, then I think we've missed it. So that's there's a process there. And therefore, even when we talk about this circles back to capacity building, whether capacity building or capacity strengthening, whatever that looks like, so that the whole issue of what we're talking about, measurement and metrics and all kinds of things, that's part of the menu of capacity building pathways, if we think about it from that perspective. So that this whole measurement is not an add-on that comes now when we realize, oh, we need to bring that in and therefore help people, now sort of fixing it in, squeezing it in to help, to assist, let's say support. I don't like to use the word help because it seems like it's a, it just facilitates the power dynamic issue. So that it's from the get-go, this measurement process is of use to the community and to the people who are, not just the people who are the gatekeepers, as it were, and around the table, but to that person who is going to be, whose life is going to be different, whose life is going to be transformed as a result of the inputs that are going into the adaptation process. So I think I'm pitching for just a process of keeping it simple and then the data being utilized and of use to the person for whom we all are here representing, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. Over to you, Aditya, for any responses and to close off. And then, yes, thank you, Dorothy. To close off before we go to the next part of the session.
I'll be brief. No, Dorothy, Bill, thank you for those comments. Dorothy, I think most of you all is very valuable advice that I've taken. I was making notes very furiously when you were talking with me. All this is very useful. And I think this call for simplicity is something that we're hearing again and again, because I feel overall the field of resilience measurement is full of so many complex frameworks that I feel people on the ground find difficult to really implement in the context of tangible project processes. That the last thing we need is another set of intersecting circles and overturned triangles and arrows going in different directions. So we're trying to keep this tool as easily operationalizable as possible. And I think Bill's question, I think, again, it's a really valuable question, right? How do we make sure that this process is actually putting agency front and center and not really reinforcing existing inequities in power that afflict the context in which adaptation plays out? Bill, again, I would argue that I think what we're doing is a bit more limited in the context of these are the guidelines and markers that will inform processes of evaluation. Now, I'm sure, like I'm sure you have been part of some processes. I have some that are extremely progressive and really challenge power structures where we might be using PRI type approaches to answer evaluation questions. I've also been part of, I'm ashamed to say, some very technocratic, linear, expert-led evaluation processes where we go in and speak to local elites and think that our job is done. So how these markers are used by which kind of process, I feel like we have relatively little control over. I would, however, again, I try to underline that what we're trying to do with these markers is ensure that the spirit of LLA comes to life. And I would argue that LLA in itself is a transformative idea, which has agency at the heart of it.
Thanks very much, Aditya. So now we're going to move from the markers and this discussion and questions Aditya is asking us to really look internally and be reflective on our own processes, our own measurement, who we are measuring for, who gains from our measurement. And we're going to do this through a fishbowl discussion. So we just encourage you, Suchi will explain to us the process, but basically people are going to be sitting in the middle and Suchi's going to ask some questions, and we ask you to please be reflective, to please be open-minded, to please be kind. You might feel some discomfort at times, but just to stay with it and allow those feelings of discomfort, because in order for us to really start progressing and changing how we're measuring and being more effective, I think there's going to have to be some discomfort. So, Suchi, can I hand over to you now? Okay, and you can introduce some more.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Aditya. Thank you for intervening. We'd have loved to have you here. Also because this was meant to be provoking to you as well, as someone who's designing these momentous markers or whatever you call them. But it was meant to be a reflection on all of us. So we'd have loved you to be around. Anyway, we can't. But thank you very much for joining. And bye-bye. We'll sorry, but you can hang around, but we'll have to kind of move screens to a different
I'll
listen
slide. I'll lurk and listen in for a bit.
Yes, please. Yes, please. You're more than welcome. We wish we could have had you here. Seriously. Anyway, with that, we are gods. Seriously. With that, we get into ground rules. May I request all of you who have laptops open to shut down your laptops? Please be present. Phones inside, please. Only I am allowed because I have my questions on the phone. So if I'm looking at the phone, it's only, yeah. Thank you. It's to check our questions and our time. So please be present. We'd love to have you listening in, to reflect, and to talk, basically, and to listen, to actively listen as well. So it's more of a response and reflection session. So. Today is also World Yoga Day, apparently. So breathe in, deep breaths, focus on your breaths, and like focus in to the fishbowl, and let's begin. Michelle's talked about the rest, and we can just directly begin. So we have a few questions for you. We also, in order to kind of start conversations, we have a few people who already know of these questions, who are sort of our initiators, who'll provoke thought, who'll provoke responses. So we'd love for you to respond to whatever they are saying, and we'd love for them to also come in. How many of you have done fishbowls before? If I need to go over the rules, not many, clearly. So basically, the idea is that whoever is speaking is part of this inner circle, and everyone outside is listening carefully. And there is an invitation for people to come in, sit, speak, and go back. So every time you have a thought, come in, speak, and go back. And you're allowed to do that multiple times. We have our initiators of conversations who will come in and probably go back and probably come in again, depending on what their thoughts are on these topics. We haven't really like discussed or prepped them, but they only know of the questions beforehand. So welcome, join us in this session. Thank you. So picking on from some of the bits that were being spoken about towards the end around questions around capacity strengthening, and looking at the locally led adaptation principles as shifting the locus of power back to the people who really kind of have the agency to adapt, right? They're already adapting, irrespective of whether we're there or not. They're already adapting, and I mean, we all agree to that. They don't necessarily need us to adapt. They definitely need us, probably, and I hope, to adapt better, maybe. Sometimes we are the source of the problem. Sometimes we end up creating maladaptation situations. So so we don't always, we may have the best of intentions, but we don't always enter with the best outputs, or don't always go out with the best outputs, and keeping that in mind. That's an uncomfortable point that I'm raising right up front, inviting you to raise more uncomfortable points, things that would bring discomfort in among all of us. So with that, I'd like to invite Joseph and Ariel to start out. Welcome, Joseph, Ariel. Please pick up the mic, because we have people listening online as well, watching, so we'd love for them to listen. And we would invite others as well, as you hear them and as you feel like coming in, please come in and talk. And so you heard what Aditya was talking about, these markers, these principles. There are also issues of, and a lot of conversation was about communities being consulted or being represented, and how they are kind of observed, and what are the assumptions do you feel that underline these choices of measurement that we kind of take? What are those assumptions? And you have some great examples, I know. How would you?
Yes, thank you for this moment. You know, I think many things have changed in my mind since, let's say, 10 days ago. Because before talking about locally adaptation, there's something important. Locally expressed needs. Are we able to understand what the community really needs to make it in parallel with the agency? Because what have been whispered 10 days ago is totally different from what we are trying to address as problem here. It's a very active and actual problem. So I will try to summarize what I heard. I was in my country in Congo, and people are expressing having a problem with cassava, you know, because cassava is the master of our food. And we eat cassava roots and cassava leaves, but it was hit by a disease. So the secretary community said, okay, we have this problem, we cannot use our cassava as we used to do before. And we have some leaves are becoming not edible, and roots we have many dots. So okay, we have a solution. And the donor put money for the research to buy some more, another variety of cassava. So the farmers were very happy to get. But the problem is that the cassava provided to farmers, okay, focus on the yield. Okay, now we can have 5 times more yield than before. But there is a problem. Leaves are no longer edible. It means that farmers, they do not want to increase the yield of the cassava. They want to have good cassava leaves and good cassava roots. You see, so the solution might be a problem, might jeopardize food value chain. So the problem is, I think the problem lies in understanding the needs expressed by those who must be the beneficiary, those who must lead the adaptation agency. So that's a problem. I didn't think about that before, but now the problem is it, and it's real. You know, the problem. Another problem was the donor focused on increasing the yield and the profitability. As the local people, they don't think about having tons of cassava. They think about, because if we cannot eat cassava leaves, then we have a very big problem. You see, so it's quite out of the cycle of our discussion scope, but it's something I have fun.
That's very interesting, and I'd invite reflections. The assumption that Joseph is talking about is the assumption of yield versus the assumption of diversity of food and what's important in food. And can I invite more people to talk about their reflections around around examples or around existing methods that you're using, any assumptions that you've been using, which you're questioning already or not questioning. I mean, you may be okay with those assumptions and come in and say, I'm okay with it. Step in, Priya.
Yeah, my name is Priya, and I work with an organization called ASAR in India. So I want to, I totally understand and feel what is being shared. And I want to share one of our experiences. It's a learning experience from us, from our side, because we started working on climate resilient agriculture. And for years we've been working on it. But almost a year and a half back, we had this experience where, when our farmers, the people that we work with, they had a very good crop that year, and which was devastated by sudden rains, just before harvest. And that got the community thinking about what can we do, because that was the huge loss. They'd invested so much in it. And this community has, old farmers as well as younger people who've come there, because they initially thought organic farming was cool. So they had their jobs in IT, which they quit to come and do organic farming in that region. So it was a mixed farming group. So you had people who are really experienced with learnings and young people who didn't have that, that huge learning, but they brought a lot of tech background with them because they were techies. But they were very interested in farming. This group actually started talking about what they could do. And the work we supported was climate resilient agriculture, but out of their discussions, the need for, the farmers started talking about if we knew that the rains would come, in 2 days' time, if we had anything that could help us predict that, then we could have done so much of, we could have saved our crop. And from there, the discussions actually led us to something which we tried to pilot, which was the nowcasting stuff, which is basically we connected the group, which was the Farmers Collective, to the University of Science and Technology, who till then basically gave, rain forecasts or, climate forecasts over 15 or days or something like that. We asked them if they could give us more localized forecast for the next 5 days. And with that, the farmers groups themselves got that forecast. And there was a core group that basically decided that they want to add an advisory, a crop advisory to it. And this was their idea, because for them, the younger farmers felt that, getting that forecast was good and we can just share it in WhatsApp and people will know what to do. But the older farmers in the group felt that that has to be accompanied by a crop advisory which says that, okay, if it's going to rain in 2 days, if this is your crop, then maybe you can do this for it. Or if this is the humidity and there could be this pest attack. So actually we saw that thing that was developed, and it's not a very hi-fi kind of a thing which has a lot of data coming in or anything. It's just a WhatsApp message. It's a simple WhatsApp message that is forwarded to farmers every single day. But it has a bunch of people who thought about it together. And it had nothing to do with us, because we were working on climate resilient agriculture. This idea came from there. So I think there is... the process, as we spoke, was very important. I feel more importantly, I felt that the most important thing was to allow ourselves to commit mistakes, because we are trying new things. We are always, I feel that as people who work with communities, there's this top-bottom thing where we think we know a lot and we go there. And in order to kind of change, I think there's a lot of these conversations about metrics and measurement. For me, I think it's internal change. It's a transformation that I, as a development professional, needs to undergo to be able to make that change. And it's a mindset change that I have to push through before I can actually start looking at metrics and measurement and what is truly community-led. Because there's a certain way that we've been taught, and if I have to kind of kind of really want to look at all of this, I think there's a de-learning journey out there for me. So like, yeah, that's what I wanted to share.
I want to close the session and go. That's all I wanted to say. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Lina. I work for an NGO that works in agribusiness and agriculture, particularly in Mozambique. A lot of our interventions that also coincide with other NGO interventions are pushing for these improved varieties of seeds, that pushing for monocultures to smallholder farmers, taking the diversity of their soils, not taking into consideration the locally grown seeds, you said cassava, not to name sorghum, and others, finding ourselves pushing for pesticides that they don't even know how to use properly, disacknowledging the local knowledge of their plants that they also use as pesticides. And then my example, and it's more of a question, how we address these things, because it's beyond, like it's a very structural thing, right? If you try to link the dots, there are monopolies that produce agricultural inputs that are pushing the lobbies of the countries that are giving the money to these countries. And this is a very structural, huge money thing that goes beyond us giving so much value to the knowledge and these locally adaptation things. It's a difficult question. It's just
That's a
putting it
great
here.
question. Can I open the floor for more reflections to that? I don't even need to ask questions. We have a question right here. Is there anyone who, please, welcome. Join in, Charles.
Yes, thank you, Joseph, for bringing out the cassava value chain. And my contribution is on the reflection from the private sector yesterday, where we had a presentation from the private sector champion, and he emphasized on endurance in the value chain. And you try to separate products from the cassava, that leaves are not edible. From your perspective, what should be done, especially to build resilience along the cassava value chain as a product that has been adopted by the community and has become part of their food culture?
Now, you know, this question was not in my mind 2 weeks ago, you know. But it's become a concern for me because it was quite simple. I think the problem came when from those who went to listen to the community, I think they missed to understand that cassava is not a single plant. Cassava is a DNA of that community, because cassava leaves, it's called sakasaka, is the main dish of the community. If they can no longer eat cassava leaves, then what can expect? Maybe, let's say, they will rely on aid then. When it's a region where it was the most productive region in Congo. You see, I think what should be done is, okay, to select, first to understand the social social habit of the population, what cassava represent, and then to see. I think that those roots were developed in a country where they don't eat cassava leaves. So most important, because the problem was not having the best roots, but the point was just addressing the disease, just killing the disease of the variety that population know. That's the only problem. They could provide this another variety of cassava for those big farmers who want to produce a lot. But for most of the farmers, they just need to have food, a quantity of food, because cassava is the very best plant for adaptation. It doesn't need any water. You just plant it, and raining or during drought or rain, there is no problem. what can be done is we have to go back, we have to respect, we have to identify what are the traditional seeds, and just work on it. Try to address the problem expressed, not to bring solution which goes beyond the problem. Let's start with addressing the actual needs, only this one, and then we can move step by step and go further. That's the problem.
Thank you, Joseph. I'll probably move to another question, or do you want to come in? And I wanted to ask Ariel, and just as a bit of introduction, Ariel is from Cameroon, and she shall probably answer us in French because that's the language she is more proficient in. And one of the things that we felt we consciously needed to do was include more voices as a group that's thinking about underrepresented voices. There is also a large group of people in Francophone Africa that don't get heard outside of their region. So, which is why we have Ariel here. And thank you for joining us. On that question of assumption, can you delve a little deeper and talk about what are those experiences where you have where you feel that we need to scratch deeper around getting heard, like being heard? Do you get my question? I'm sorry. Do I need to be a little more clear?
Maybe.
Yeah. So my question is, has there ever been an experience where you felt that you were saying a thing and it was not a language that was affecting what you were trying to convey, but the experience was not felt or heard? Was there ever that space that you needed to navigate? Is that clear?
No, I will explain. I'm just a new interpreter.
So Joseph's going to translate for us, but this is also an open question to everyone. Is there a space? And I often feel that I need new vocabulary to speak to a lot of different people, and especially we've felt the need for knowledge brokers. Are there spaces, and this is again scratching that question of agency and working with communities, are there spaces where we feel the need for bridging that gap of vocabulary? And if anyone wants to share experiences where you have had that, please come in. We let Ariel, but you come in. Yeah, no, please come in. Yes.
Ok. Bonjour à tout le monde. Oui. D'accord. Très ravi d'être ici parmi vous aujourd'hui et de participer à ce forum. Je m'appelle Ariel, je viens du Cameroun et je suis une philo du programme WICA, Women Initiative in Central Africa, in Climate Action, pardon. Bon, l'expérience que je vais partager ici, où on a apporté des solutions à des populations et qu'ils ne comprenaient pas, c'est dans la zone agroécologique camerounaise, la zone sudano-sahélienne. C'est une zone où il y a déjà un manque de précipitations et où les conditions sont très arides.
Thank you. Yes, so Ariel is a young researcher. She belongs to WICA, Women in Climate Action, I think. Yeah, she comes from Cameroon, and she will be talking about an experience she experienced in a region which is at the borderline between the desert, they say Sahel. So in that zone, there is a scarcity of rain. So they are quite facing some drought.
Ok. Bon, ici également, les populations font face à lorsqu'il y a des précipitations, elles font face à des chocs, des inondations qui se vivent dans la zone. Bon, maintenant, il était question ici, n'est-ce pas, de renforcer les capacités des populations, de renforcer leur résilience aux chocs, aux aléas climatiques, notamment les inondations.
So in that zone, being facing drought, when it rains, they face flooding. So the concern was how to enforce the adaptation capacity to climate change.
D'accord. Bon, ici maintenant, étant donné que cette région est aride et que les précipitations sont assez rares, lorsqu'il y a des inondations, pour la population, pour certaines, ils ne voient pas le danger que représentent les inondations pour elles. Bon, ici, elles ne comprennent pas quel est le danger que cela peut représenter. Et bon,
yes, but in this region, there is a no, the population, they don't have a clear understanding where is the problem, in fact, because they are facing drought, and when the rains come, for them, it's quite normal, you know, because they are not able to understand the real problem. For them, it's a normal situation. So, and yes.
Ok, bon, parce qu'avec les inondations, ça permet, et ils voient ça comme un avantage parce que ça fait, il y a de l'eau pour les cultures. Bon, la perception des populations sur le danger, c'est un peu différent. Bon, il était question ici là d'évaluer la capacité des populations est-ce qu'elles comprennent effectivement le danger, parce que si on veut renforcer leur résilience ici là, il faudrait qu'elles puissent déjà percevoir qu'il y a un danger et pourquoi est-ce qu'on veut renforcer leur résilience.
Yeah. So for them, having that water coming through the rain was, a benefit, in fact, when it was, in fact, a problem of climate change. So before bringing to them climate, the installation, they need to be trained on climate literacy, understanding what climate change is, because without this understanding of the fact, you cannot bring any actions.
Okay. Bon, l'action ici, il a été question également de sensibiliser les populations déjà sur le danger que cela peut représenter pour elles, et également, n'est-ce pas, pour les aider avec les précipitations et les pluies qui arrivent. Il y a des périodes, il y a des périodes agricoles où on leur conseille de faire des semis. Mais pendant les zones maintenant d'inondation, on ne les conseille pas de rester dans ces zones-là. Bon, et au niveau des communautés, il y a des barrages que l'on fait pour essayer de repousser un peu l'eau pour que ça n'envahisse pas les zones.
Yes, so it's what was done for them to advise them to move in certain area where they can put seed on the soil to start the growth of the plant, and also to build some dams to avoid also how the water come in the field. So it was a process of learning and to adapt the work to the new situation. I'm trying to do my best. Okay. I don't know if the translation was accurate, but I tried.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. And thanks, Sanyal. I'll follow up on the matter of assumptions and changing vocabulary from an experience that we had in our activity. We all celebrate, when we talk about financial inclusion, and we celebrate graduation, and that's where we're supposed to go with the resilience. And so, yes, as is common to our development work, that's exactly what we did in our activity. And 5-year activity, so by year 4 we were thinking and planning, and of course we had missed in our country, in Uganda, there was a lockdown for nearly 24 months. So we didn't go out into the community, but we kept in touch via digital processes. So we were very eager to start the graduation action points. And, that was in our work plan, and therefore we were all good to go. And so we used that as a nomenclature. We are going to be graduating at this, And we work with, we work with existing structures as part of our community-led approach. And in as far as livelihoods and diversifying income, we work with a cadre of people that we have called business service providers. In different countries, they're called change agents and so on. So business service providers, that's our last mile, the people who we have worked with in as far as helping them, building their skills in as far as agronomy practices and improved seeds, the connection between them and the National Research Organization, etc. And also connecting them with private sector so that they can aggregate produce and so on and so forth. And so that was our first, that's the group of people, and we were going to be working with in as far as this graduation journey is concerned. And there was pushback from this, our community structure. There was complete pushback. And what we were then to learn as we went deeper into the conversation and actually allowed them to take the driver's seat is that for them, graduation meant you're cutting us off. Because therefore, all the skills we have received and so on, you are not going to be there with us to help, to support our journey. And they were completely against graduation. And so we realized that it was actually a nomenclature, an approach. We were not communicating, we were not talking to each other. And therefore we dropped the graduation nomenclature, and we talked through the approach. And the whole approach, because we were giving them a small, stipend for the skills building, transport refund, etc., to come for the skills building sessions and so on. But what we found was that, in terms of the approach, we then harnessed that connection, for instance, with private sector, so that the skills they had built, they could now work together as a team and connect with the private sector who would bring the whatever products, the inputs that were required, so that people then did not have to make the journey to the city to get the inputs and think for themselves, but that this group of people, the business service providers, could connect with they had the ability now to connect with the private sector. They had the ability to connect with the research organization and their representatives. They had the ability to aggregate produce, and on all those touch points, they were making money. And that was really graduation. Because at the end of the story, resilience is about putting money in people's pockets if it's livelihoods, and allowing them then to be able to have more choice in as far as what they can do. And so that, therefore, was graduation, but we had to change the nomenclature and how we were talking to each other. And it has been a successful venture when we did that, where actually, and the whole point was, the graduation also for us was weaning them out of requiring, donor-funded stipend to come for the skills building sessions, etc. If anything, they now even were not available because they were able to diversify their own personal incomes, they were able to make money, and they were able to really graduate and successfully, and that has actually become a hub where the government has recognized it and working through the process of these, we're calling them farmer service centers. But the whole issue of assumptions of just the terminology was a whole thing, and that counts across the board. So it was a real learning opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I have 5 minutes, but I'm also going to invite Gina to come in, and I had, and I will come back to you, but just a reflection on the role of the expert and rethinking agency. We say community-led, and therefore Aditya raised an important point about community-led probably putting the burden of the whole project or the whole fundraising and all the aspects of the project cycle on the community, and that's the general assumption. Are we talking about the expert being completely out? Is there a role for the expert in this new form of thinking where the community is not a beneficiary but a change agent? Do you think there's some reflections there?
Yes. And I'd like to be provocative because I feel the last 2 days has kind of idealized community quite a lot. And I think it's unfair to expect community to continue to do the hard work when there are many of us in positions of power who actually need to do the hard work. So, yes, when appropriate, I think it's absolutely essential that we rethink how we work in these situations. But I think those of us who are privileged enough to have resources and have comforts need to do more hard work rather than saying, oh, okay, now we need to pass on to the community because they're the ones experiencing the impacts of climate change, for example. And I've got lots more to say, but maybe I'll stop there as a provocative statement because I see we have a new member.
Yes, we have two views. I'll hand over to you. Oh, we have three. I'll hand over to you, and then you can hand over to Nabil, and then Priya.
Okay, thank you.
And then back to Gina, maybe. I'll skip.
Thank you, Suchi. I'm Dicta from Spark, and Spark is supporting pastoralism and agriculture in areas of protracted and recurrent crisis. And is doing some work in the Sahel region of Nigeria, where I'm working for them. And we're also in southern Sudan, doing some work with the same set of people. But what I want to say now is not, is related to the discussion by, sorry, is that Joseph. And talking about the cassava leaf and cassava roots issue. We have, from our own experiences on the field, we have seen that in most cases, while developing technologies, whether it be new crop, a crop innovation, a management practice, experts like us who have been in, professors of agriculture, we think we know it. We think we are the experts. But in reality, the local farmers are the experts. And when we start any intervention, for any intervention, we must start from them. Because the confusion about what is more important to them, whether it's the cassava root or the cassava leaf, it's them to decide. But if we feel, because of resilience, there's more money coming to them from the roots, then there must be a way of ensuring that there's no reduction in cassava leaves, either by making them produce a type of cassava just for the leaves, while you produce for the roots, for the comers. And once they are put into the process, we had a situation like that, and initially it was a top-down. But when we got to the community, it was a Muslim community, so even getting the women to dialogue was an issue. Even I had to dress like a Muslim woman and, sit the way they sit, so that I'm not seen as wanting to defile or bring strange Western ways. We were able to find out that when we engaged women and their voices were heard, we recorded their voices, and when we analyzed it, we were able to get them to, we still achieved what we wanted to achieve without undermining their own priority. So I think listening to them and hearing them and imputing their desires and their priority into our models would make us a win-win situation. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Hi. Hi. So I'm Nabil. I'm with Intifa, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say it, but mostly I've been in the space of public health and public engagement, so that's sort of my field when it comes to inclusive pathways in different ways and co-design processes. I've also been one of those people that have been in projects like this when I was a kid up to high school. So I've always tried to offer a critique, but your voice only goes to a certain level because, I mean, there's multiple. The way we conceive of projects are often very colonial, and it's an imposition, right? So we design the projects, we ask you for your input. We have applied for the funds, it rests with us. You can sort of access us when there's something that's needed. We bring you the parameters for your decision making. We determine what's the success of a project to the complete exclusion of the local value and knowledge system. William made a point of representation, and we speak to those people that speak English, comes to us, maybe has resources already, so you can take the minimum stipend to get involved so we can tick our boxes. So I sit here with this discomfort of conversations around agency and resilience, and I wonder if instead there's a space to speak about self-determination and what would happen when a lot of these people we conceive of as static communities could run the projects themselves, and the metrics for success are guided by that local value system. And I'm just sort of thinking of projects I've worked in before where we've tried to come up with M&E strategies that are somewhat inclusive, but locally, if people were talking about the project tomorrow and moving forward, that's success. But our timelines don't account for that because we have to deliver quite fast. And then there's this weird sort of structural gatekeeping that happens. We're working on a project, and next week we have to run to this next community, completely ignore this community I've worked on around water, sanitation, access to water. These people don't have water, right? But I'm going to go run to this next project. So there's this structural gatekeeping that happens, that we continuously confound and define communities based on what we are providing, glorifying ourselves. At no point do we appoint half of our salaries to those local leadership structures or even locals. So often we start speaking about participatory approaches as the antithesis of this colonial thought pattern, yet we all try and squeeze into it so often, which bothers me. And I don't have the answer for it, but I just wondered, you know, like when we start speaking about community-led, we are defining everything. So I don't know, I don't really have the question, but yeah, and something in the presentation earlier was speaking around, and forgive me if I'm not saying it right, but it's speaking around, can we expect them or people to fit into these models, or how much can we expect of them, yet we're not stretching ourselves to fit into these knowledge systems. We're not even attempting it. You know, so I'm bothered by trying to find common ground between all these conversations, if I have to admit.
Yeah, and I think I'm also going to say something that's a little explosive, which someone at some point in time asked me when I was talking about communities and them being this thing, because Gina just now said that you can't expect communities to do everything. I just wanted to, I'm thinking aloud, again, forgive me if I am ruffling too many feathers, but it's not always that communities also take the right decisions for themselves and for the environment. Like in one of the pieces of work that we were doing, we realized that we were working with farming communities, and again, in a water-stressed region, we were working on solar-powered pumps. We were pushing for that, but then we realized that farmers just switch on the pumps and leave it on for hours and hours. They do not have to pay money for it because it's subsidized, but in a region that has already very low water levels, that was really doing bad for them and everybody in the region. So, like, it's not always that we all know, like, I don't know everything that's good for me, I may be wrong. Similarly, I think we don't need to judge the community also. Like, there are things that they may need support with, or, you know, help with, or I don't know what is the exact word. So then what is our role? You know, that's a question that I've always, again, asked within our organization, and I've asked myself. And I have felt that maybe the role is the role of an enabler, a facilitator, where you just connect different people together so that people can make the right choices.
That's what's helped me personally, I think, in times of crisis. So like I don't know all the answers, but somewhere somebody else knows it. And if they don't take away my decision making, but connect me to enable me to make better choices, it's helped me. So that's something that I felt.
I just want to let everyone know that it's officially the end of the session, if you want to be official, but it's lunchtime now. So if you can, and I think it would be good to let everyone finish saying their say. I think the stories and the listening that's coming out is possibly the most valuable insight that I've got from this. So if you can stay for another 5 to 10 minutes, please do, but you're also welcome to leave if you have to. I just wanted to signpost.
We were just warming up.
We were. Hello, everyone. My name is Archana. I'm from India. I work with the indigenous communities in the Himalayas. I live with them. And so I would bring a few learnings for me as a person who has been there for a while now. Few of the things I've realized is that a lot of things that we speak about, the language, the words, it's a very, I don't know, right word, wrong word, colonized language. It's a very privileged language that the communities don't understand, right? So I think somewhere we need to also figure out what is our narratives that we take to the communities when we talk about these kind of things that we talk about, because they look at things from a very different perspective. Right? Development can mean one thing to us and it can mean completely different things to them. So what is that commonality of language? What is that commonality of understanding that we have with the communities? And that is the consistency we need to first bring in even before we can start looking at solutions. The other thing is looking at diversity, right? I work on diversity. I work with transgenders in indigenous context and in other contexts as well. And one of the things I've realized is that it's not just gender diversity, it is age diversity, it is culture, it is financial diversity, it is diversity at so many levels and through so many lenses. And if we are not mindful of those when we enter any particular space, then we are not really looking at it from the true sense of what the community might represent. The third thing that I've been experiencing a lot within the communities is the conflict, generational conflict that is now happening. So let's see, there are cash crops that we have a lot in India. We have something known as jhum cultivation. They make brooms out of it, okay? And they just sell it for a few months in a year, but it gives them enough money to last them the whole year. But the younger generation is realizing that that particular crop is not the best for the community in the long term, because it is basically depleting the water resources, it is harming the environment. So now there is a cultural conflict between two generations looking at the same thing. One is saying, I need to sustain today, and the other is saying, I still need to live 40 years from now. So how do we basically also enter into that space sensitively, because I'm still an outsider. So my job there is to listen and to be a bridge of conversations to say, you know what, something like this is probably happening in Latin America and in Africa too. And this is what they did. I can provide a perspective, but I can't provide a solution. Not my job. At the end of the day, the community needs to come together and find solutions. I think that's what we can just be facilitators. We can co-create and we can invite them into conversation. The other very important things that are emerging is the conversation and conflict around religious beliefs. Now, a lot of indigenous communities in the Himalayas have converted into, the church came in and they said, we protect you, we provide you food, home, shelter, you come to us. But they were all pagans before they became Catholics or they went to church, right? Now, the younger generation wants to go back to that belief. And their grandparents, our parents are like, what the hell, we don't do that. We don't worship earth. But the younger generation is saying, okay, I'll come to church for you on Sundays. Leave me alone for the rest of the 6 days, So that is happening. And I'm like, wow. So, you know, I think these are also a lot of things to navigate our way across when we really look at the impact and when we look at evidence, when we look at resilience. There are a lot of these hidden layers that we don't explore or come in contact with when we are just going from a certain perspective and matrix to understand what's really happening over there. So when somebody was talking about designing the whole space from the lens of the community, then can they be in the driver's seat to say that, I would like to know about this, this, and this. Not feeding them a question and saying, how do you see it, but inviting them to ask questions that they feel is relevant to them, their growth, and their community. So I think that is very essential. And asking difficult questions, what Lena asked, I think is so important. What are we doing as a community to take these difficult questions and findings back to the governments, right? GMO is being forced onto our farmers like nobody's business in India. But a lot of farmers today are resisting it. There are states which have considered it to be criminalized if we use our own traditional indigenous seeds, right? What are we doing collectively as a community to take that voice of our people to the world? So I think these are some of the things that we really need to talk about when we are looking at this and bringing those voices really into these forums. Thank you.
Yeah, mine is a bit quick. There seemed to be some tension in terms of whether we need to define a community or, leave it as an open space where there is some self-definition. But it would be good to understand that if we don't define the communities we are talking about, how do you, and I'm happy to get reflections from anybody from the room, how do you think we can clarify the community voices when it comes to the policy processes if we don't define what we refer to as a community? Yeah, what ways should we ensure that whoever we are referring to as a community is clear, is clear in terms of what their perspectives with regards to resilience is all about. And the second challenge which I want to throw to the room is that why should we speak for the communities? Can't the communities speak for themselves? And in what ways can we ensure that we give the communities we are referring to the space to be able to really raise their own voices? And I am saying this because there has been a lot of, the community, as I was saying in the panel, the community narrative has become a very popular narrative. Let's empower our communities. Let's support our communities. Let's build their resilience. But the question is, these communities we are talking about and the people, taking charge in terms of representing their voices, are we speaking about the communities that really need these interventions, or which kind of communities are we talking about? I know there is a very strong role of the civil society, and I don't want to go into that space in terms of supporting, and advocating for the needs and the aspirations of these communities. The question is, which communities are being propelled? Whose interests are being represented? Can we enable the communities we are talking about today to talk about their aspirations, their resilience aspirations? Can we avoid distorting the voices of the communities? And how do we do that? Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, so I'm going to end off the formal part of the session now, but please, everyone's welcome to stay and chat or find someone that was speaking and speak to them further. I think what's really come out is that there was, at the beginning, there were talk of markers, which I think is a start. It's a start because what's come out very clearly is that very few projects are led by communities. So what Aditya is starting to do is starting, I think, and IED is starting to get people to think about it in quite a simple way. But what has come out for me very clearly is that listening and stories and narratives are also important. And in so many cases, like with a Kasava, that if people were listening and telling stories and getting to know each other in whatever way that is, and respect each other, I think that's kind of where we need to go. But just acknowledging that it's all very complex and there doesn't really seem to be any easy answers. So thank you so much to everybody for participating. Thank you for your stories. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for asking difficult questions and just being courageous and speaking. So thank you very much. And thank you, Shruti, and not Shruti, Suchi. Sorry, Suchi.
That's fine. And thank you, Aditya, and thank you, Michelle. Great. Thank you, everyone.